Welcome to History Teller YT, where forgotten voices and untold stories of the past come alive. Today, we dive deep into the epic saga of the Subanen, the river people of Mindanao, whose journey through exile, raids, and colonial intrusion is one of resilience and survival. From the rise of the Moro Sultanates and their devastating slave raids, to the crushing weight of Spanish campaigns, the upheavals of American rule, and the struggles under the Philippine nation-state, the Subanen endured centuries of displacement. Yet through it all, they preserved their rituals, their identity, and their spirit. This is not just a history of suffering, but of courage, a reminder that survival is not only about enduring hardship, but also about protecting memory and culture against the tides of domination. Stay with me, because this story will move you, inspire you, and remind you why history matters. Long before the arrival of foreign powers, long before the rise of Islamic sultanates and the intrusion of Spanish colonizers, the Zamboanga Peninsula was home to the Subanen people. They are widely regarded as the earliest inhabitants of the region, living along the riverbanks, valleys, and fertile plains that stretched across what is now Zamboanga del Sur, Misamis Occidental, and parts of Lanao del Norte. The very name Subanen comes from the word Suba, meaning river, which reflects their identity as river dwellers and cultivators of the fertile lowlands. The river was not simply a geographical feature for them. It was the very lifeline of their community, providing food, water, transport, and spiritual meaning. Fishing, small-scale agriculture, and inter-village trade were the foundations of their economy, and the Subanen became masters at adapting their livelihood to the ebb and flow of the waterways. Their settlements were organized in clusters along these rivers, where extended families built houses on stilts to withstand flooding during the rainy season. The Timuays, the community leader, was chosen not only for wisdom and experience, but also for fairness and ability to settle disputes. Governance was consensual, with decision-making involving elders and respected figures who held authority through reputation rather than coercion. Social cohesion was anchored in rituals, communal farming, and celebrations that reinforced solidarity. One such celebration was the Bucklog, a Thanksgiving ritual that involved music, dance, and offerings to the spirits, performed when communities had survived disasters, won in hunting, or gathered a bountiful harvest. The Bucklog symbolized not only gratitude, but also resilience, the capacity to endure hardship and recover together. The Subanen worldview was deeply animistic, rooted in reverence for the spirits of rivers, forests, and mountains. They believed that every natural feature had guardians, and offending them could bring calamity. Hence, rituals accompanied almost every major activity, from planting crops to fishing expeditions. By honoring the spirits, they sought balance and protection in a world they viewed as interconnected and sacred. Oral traditions tell of their ancestors navigating vast stretches of Mindanao, but choosing the rivers of Zamboanga as their permanent homeland due to its abundance. In these lands, they thrived in relative isolation, forming kinship-based networks that linked communities across valleys and rivers. For centuries, this way of life remained undisturbed, their settlements sustained by fertile land and flowing rivers. Yet, beneath the surface of their harmony with the environment lay vulnerabilities. They were small, scattered communities with limited weaponry and little experience in dealing with external threats. When regional powers began to emerge in Mindanao, the Subanen soon found their peaceful existence tested by forces beyond their control. The Subanen were not simply subsistence farmers or isolated villagers. They had a complex cultural identity shaped by their environment and traditions. At the heart of their social structure was the family unit, bound by kinship ties that extended across multiple generations. Families pooled labor for planting, harvesting, and community defense, and kinship ties dictated alliances, marriage arrangements, and even settlement patterns. The Timuay, or chieftain, served as the guardian of these relationships, ensuring fairness in disputes, guiding rituals, and representing the community in times of conflict or negotiation. Unlike the hierarchical and militarized structures that would later dominate Mindanao, Subanen leadership was rooted in cooperation and service, where authority depended on moral standing rather than coercive power. Their livelihood revolved around shifting agriculture, fishing, and gathering. The fertile valleys allowed for the cultivation of rice, corn, and root crops, while the rivers teemed with freshwater fish. Hunting supplemented their diet, and forest products such as rattan and resin were traded with neighboring groups. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence indicates that Subanen trade extended to coastal communities long before external powers arrived. Salt, shells, and beads were exchanged for agricultural goods, creating a network of interdependence that linked the riverine communities to the wider economy of Mindanao. Culturally, the Subanen were rich in oral tradition. Stories passed down through generations told of creation, ancestral heroes, and the spirits that govern nature. These stories not only entertained but also educated, teaching values of bravery, respect, and communal duty. Music and dance were integral to their rituals. The agung, a type of gong, and the kalintang, a set of small, horizontally laid gongs, provided rhythm during gatherings, while dances mimicked natural movements such as the swaying of bamboo or the flight of birds. These performances reinforced a sense of identity, connecting individuals to their ancestors and the spirit world. Spiritual life was guided by the Balian or spiritual leader, often a woman, who mediated between the community and the unseen forces. Through rituals, prayers, and offerings, the Balian sought healing for the sick, protection from misfortune, and harmony with the environment. The presence of these spiritual leaders highlights the gender balance in Subanen society, where women played significant roles in religion, family life, and even decision-making. Yet, while rich in culture and traditions, the Subanen were vulnerable in terms of defense. Their weapons, spears, bows, and shields, were effective for hunting and small skirmishes, but insufficient against large, organized raiding forces. The very openness of their riverine settlements, which facilitated trade and communication, also left them exposed to external threats. As the 14th century approached and Islam spread across Mindanao, bringing with it the rise of the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao, the Subanen's rivers and fertile lands became targets for conquest, tribute, and raids. To understand the Subanen, one must understand their intimate relationship with their environment. The rivers were more than just water routes. They were the highways of life. Subanen villages were often situated at bends or junctions of rivers, where fishing was bountiful and the land fertile. Each community cultivated rice fields on the valley floor and root crops on the upland slopes. The forests that surrounded them provided not only food, but also building materials, medicine, and spiritual grounding. The forest was a living being, respected and feared. Subanen oral lore contains numerous warnings against disrespecting certain groves, cutting sacred trees, or polluting the water, as these acts could bring the wrath of the spirits. In their worldview, survival depended not only on human effort, but also on maintaining balance with nature. This perspective shaped their rituals, which often sought to ensure fertility of the soil, abundance of fish, and harmony with unseen forces. The bucklog, one of their most famous rituals, was a massive communal affair that could last for days. Platforms of bamboo were constructed, upon which dancers would stomp rhythmically to the sound of gongs and drums, invoking both joy and reverence. The ritual was more than celebration. It was a collective prayer for resilience, performed after surviving calamities, winning battles, or reaping a successful harvest. It was the Subanen's way of affirming life in the face of hardship. This cultural resilience allowed the Subanen to maintain their identity even in times of crisis. But their dependence on fertile valleys and open rivers also made them desirable targets for stronger neighbors. By the 14th and 15th centuries, when the Moro Sultanates began to expand, the Subanen's very strengths, their productivity, accessibility, and communal wealth, turned into vulnerabilities. Raiding expeditions targeted their villages not only for resources, but also for captives. Women and children were taken as slaves, while men were often forced into labor or military service under the sultanates. The once peaceful rivers became routes of danger, with boats carrying raiders rather than traders. For the Subanen, the coming centuries would transform their lives in ways their ancestors could hardly have imagined. Their story would shift from one of flourishing and riverine abundance to one of struggle for survival, displacement, and resilience in exile. Yet, even as external forces sought to dominate them, the Subanen spirit endured, rooted in rivers and forests, bound by kinship, and sustained by rituals that affirmed their identity against the tide of history. The 14th century marked a profound transformation in the political and cultural map of Mindanao. With the arrival of Muslim traders, missionaries, and warriors from neighboring regions such as Malacca, Brunei, and Arabia, Islam began to take firm root in coastal and riverine settlements of southern Philippines. Arab and Malay preachers introduced not only a new faith, but also a sophisticated socio-political framework anchored on the idea of centralized rule under sultan. Two major centers of Islamic power emerged during this period: the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao. The former grew dominant in the Sulu archipelago and extended its influence into Zamboanga, Basilan, and Borneo, while the latter expanded across Cotabato and Lanao, projecting its reach into northern Mindanao. For the Subanen, who until this time lived in dispersed and egalitarian communities, this new order presented both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, the rise of the sultanates brought increased trade along the coasts. Spices, textiles, ceramics, and iron tools flowed into Mindanao's markets, connecting local economies to global routes stretching from China to Arabia. Some Subanen traders and intermediaries benefited from this prosperity by exchanging forest products and agricultural surplus for coastal goods. However, this advantage came at a high price. The sultanates sought not merely trade, but control. To sustain their courts, military expeditions, and slave-based economies, they demanded tribute and submission from upland and riverine groups. The Subanen, scattered and militarily weaker, were immediately pressured by this new system of vassalage. In many cases, emissaries from the sultanates demanded rice, forest goods, or even captives as tribute. Communities that refused were marked for raiding, their villages attacked by swift Moro war fleets that navigated the very rivers on which Subanen life depended. By the late 15th century, Subanen settlements found themselves in the direct shadow of this expanding Islamic political power, as the influence of the sultanates solidified during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Subanen way of life was increasingly disrupted. Raids became a common feature of their existence. Armed expeditions composed of Tazig, Maguindanao, and Mindanao warriors moved inland along rivers, targeting villages that resisted tribute collection. The Subanen, with their limited weapons and loosely organized defense, were no match for these well-armed raiders equipped with krises, lantakas, small cannons, and swift boats. Historical records and oral traditions tell of how entire Subanen families were carried away during these incursions. Women and children were especially vulnerable, seized as slaves and sold in bustling markets in Holo, Basilan, and even as far as Borneo. Men were often given two fates, either forced into servitude or recruited as laborers and rowers in the war fleets of the sultanates. These raids destabilized Subanen communities, forcing them to abandon open settlements along rivers and retreat to more defensible areas. But this displacement came at a tremendous cost. Everyday life changed drastically. Fields once cultivated near valleys were abandoned, disrupting agricultural productivity. Families were broken apart, with some members enslaved and others left behind. The communal spirit of the Subanen, so strongly tied to their rituals and kinship, was strained under the constant fear of raids. Oral traditions describe how children were taught early to listen for the sound of approaching boats and to flee into the forest when danger threatened. Villages began building lookout posts and creating hidden paths into the mountains, strategies of survival rather than confrontation. The Timuays' role, once centered on mediation and harmony, expanded into military leadership, organizing defenses and coordinating flight during attacks. At the same time, the Subanen were not entirely passive. In some cases, they attempted to negotiate with the sultanates, paying partial tribute or forming temporary alliances with coastal powers. Yet these arrangements were fragile and often betrayed, as the rating system was too central to the Sultanate's wealth and authority. Thus, the Subanen existed in a cycle of partial submission, resistance, and retreat, never fully secure in their own homelands. Faced with relentless pressure, the Subanen responded in varied ways. Some communities chose exile, abandoning their fertile lowland fields and migrating deeper into the mountainous interiors of Zamboanga, Misamis Occidental, and Lanao. This movement reshaped their identity, as they became known less as river dwellers and more as upland survivors. The mountains offered safety, but also isolation. Crops were harder to cultivate in rocky soil, and trading opportunities diminished, cutting them off from the economic prosperity flowing through the coasts. Yet this exile was also a form of resistance. By retreating to places where raiders could not easily reach, the Subanen preserved their independence, however limited. Other groups opted for defiance. Oral histories speak of Timuays who rallied warriors to defend their settlements, arming themselves with spears, shields, and poisoned arrows. These defenses were often localized and small in scale, but they carried immense symbolic weight. A single victory against raiders could inspire entire river networks, reinforcing Subanen pride and determination. Even when outnumbered, resistance became a way to affirm their right to their lands. Spanish colonial accounts from later centuries confirm these traditions, noting that some Subanen villages outright refused to become vassals to the Moro Sultanates. Still, others chose partial accommodation, moving closer to Spanish garrisons when they arrived in the 17th century, seeking protection from Moro raids. This introduced another layer of complexity, as Subanen communities now found themselves caught between two external powers, Moro and Spanish, both demanding loyalty and tribute. What is striking, however, is that through exile, resistance, or alliance, the Subanen retained a strong sense of cultural identity. Their rituals, oral traditions, and governance structures continued to adapt. The Bucklog ritual, in particular, took on new meanings during this era. It was no longer just a Thanksgiving celebration, but also a remembrance of survival, performed after escaping raids or reuniting lost families. It became a cultural anchor, reminding the Subanen that no matter how much external powers try to dominate them, their spirit as a people remained intact. Thus, the rise of the Moro Sultanates represented both an existential threat and a catalyst for resilience. The Subanen, once riverine cultivators, were forced to redefine their lives under siege. This transformation, painful, tragic, and yet enduring, marked the beginning of their long history of survival amid domination, a history that would grow even more complex with the intrusion of Spanish colonial forces in the centuries to come. By the late 15th and well into the 16th century, the Subanen had become one of the most frequent targets of raiding expeditions launched by the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao. These raids were not random acts of violence. They were systematic and integral to the economic and political machinery of the sultanates. The flourishing slave markets of Jolo, Basilan, and even Borneo demanded a constant influx of captives, while the sultanates' need for labor to row their fleets, build their settlements, and farm their lands kept the raiding economy alive. In this system, groups like the Subanen, living along accessible rivers and valleys, but without the military capacity to resist, became prime targets. The raids often began suddenly. Subanen oral histories describe how families working in their rice fields would hear the sound of approaching boats, their drums and gongs meant to terrorize. Panic would ensue as villagers rushed to gather children and flee into the forests. Those unable to escape were captured. Women were especially prized, often taken to serve as household slaves or concubines. Children were sold into slavery, growing up in distant lands with no chance of returning home. Men who resisted were killed, while others were chained and forced into grueling labor, rowing for days in war fleets or toiling in coastal settlements under the harsh oversight of Moro captains. The psychological toll of these raids was immense. Families were torn apart, with loved ones never seen again. Villages were burned to the ground, and crops destroyed, leaving survivors not only grieving, but also starving. Oral traditions passed down among the Subanen still recall these traumatic times. Stories of mothers losing their children to slave raids, of warriors making last stands against overwhelming odds, and of communities forced to scatter into the mountains for safety. The Subanen's very identity as riverine people was under threat, as their ancestral homelands became hunting grounds for raiders. What had once been fertile and thriving communities were transformed into zones of fear and displacement. Faced with the constant threat of enslavement, many Subanen communities had little choice but to abandon their ancestral riverine lands. Historical records, alongside Subanen oral traditions, consistently describe this retreat as a survival strategy rather than a voluntary migration. Families gathered what they could carry and fled to the mountainous interiors of Zamboanga, Misamis Occidental, and Lanao del Norte. These rugged, forested terrains, though difficult to farm, offered safety through inaccessibility. Raiders could not easily pursue them into the narrow paths and steep ridges of the mountains, and so the highlands became refuges for displaced communities. This retreat radically altered Subanen life. Where once they had cultivated fertile valleys and open fields, they now carved out farms from less hospitable mountain soils. Agriculture shifted toward root crops like cassava, sweet potato, and taro, which could grow in upland environments. Rice, once the staple of their riverine existence, became harder to cultivate, and in many places was abandoned or produced only in small quantities. Villages became smaller and more defensible, often located on ridges or in concealed valleys. Watchtowers and hidden trails became common, allowing communities to spot potential raiders and flee before being captured. The Timuays' role also transformed. In earlier times, he was primarily a mediator and community leader, responsible for resolving disputes and guiding rituals. In exile, his role expanded into that of protector, strategist, and crisis leader. He coordinated defense, organized flight during raids, and maintained unity in an environment where resources were scarce and fear was constant. The communal spirit that had long defined the Subanen was tested, but it also adapted. Families relied more heavily on each other, pooling labor to survive in the harsher upland environment. The move into the mountains did not mean complete isolation. Some groups still attempted to return to their lowland fields seasonally, planting and harvesting quickly before retreating again. Others maintained trade with neighboring groups, exchanging forest products for salt and coastal goods. Yet, the retreat marked a turning point. The Subanen were no longer primarily a riverine people, but became known as upland survivors, their very identity reshaped by displacement and exile. Despite the trauma of raids and the hardship of mountain exile, the Subanen demonstrated remarkable cultural resilience. Displacement did not erase their traditions, it reshaped them. The bucklog ritual, which had long been a Thanksgiving ceremony, now acquired new layers of meaning. Communities performed bucklog after surviving raids, after safe returns from seasonal farming, or after successfully defending their villages. It became not only a prayer of gratitude, but also an affirmation of survival against overwhelming odds. The ritual's music, dance, and communal participation reminded the Subanen that despite their losses, their identity endured. Oral traditions also served as a powerful tool of resilience. Stories of brave Timuays who resisted raiders, of families who cleverly escaped slavery, and of ancestors who defended the rivers became central to Subanen identity. These stories, told and retold across generations, functioned both as historical memory and moral instruction. They taught younger generations about vigilance, courage, and unity. In this way, the memory of raids, though traumatic, was transformed into a source of collective strength. The Subanen's spiritual life, too, adapted to the new realities of exile. Rituals continued to honor the spirits of the rivers, forests, and mountains, but now prayers emphasized protection from raiders, safe passage through dangerous lands, and the healing of trauma. The role of the Balian, the spiritual leader, became even more central as communities sought solace and guidance in uncertain times. Women, often serving as Balian, ensured that the cultural and spiritual life of the people did not collapse under the weight of displacement. This ability to adapt, to transform trauma into ritual, and to preserve identity amid exile, ensured the survival of the Subanen people. While many neighboring groups were absorbed into the expanding sultanates or displaced entirely, the Subanen endured. Their retreat into the mountains was not a defeat, but a strategy of resilience, a determination to survive as a people even when stripped of their fertile lands. In the centuries to come, this resilience would again be tested, first by the continuing threat of Moro raids and later by the intrusion of Spanish colonial forces. Yet, by preserving their culture, memory, and identity, the Subanen ensured that they would not vanish from the pages of history. Though many Subanen communities abandoned their fertile river valleys for the relative safety of the mountains, not all chose exile. A number of villages resolved to remain in their ancestral homelands, determined to defend the rivers and fields that had sustained their people for generations. This decision was not made lightly. Those who stayed knew well the dangers posed by raiding expeditions. Yet, to abandon their land was to surrender a piece of their identity. For some Timuays and their followers, resistance became a matter of honor and survival, not only for themselves, but for the memory of their ancestors who had cultivated the land before them. Spanish reports, and Subanen oral traditions alike tell of Timuays who rose to prominence as defenders of their people. These leaders gathered able-bodied men and organized them into bands of warriors, armed with spears, shields made of wood or hide, and arrows often tipped with poison derived from forest plants. Although the Subanen lacked the cannons and steel weaponry of the Moro Sultanates, their knowledge of the terrain provided a significant advantage. They laid ambushes along narrow trails, used rivers as traps, and relied on fortified villages built on elevated areas for defense. Resistance, however, came at a heavy cost. Each confrontation with raiders risked devastation. Villages that resisted tribute demands often became targets of especially brutal retaliation. Crops were burned, livestock seized, and survivors carried off into slavery. Still, these acts of defiance became enshrined in Subanen oral tradition. The names of warrior Timuays and their heroic stands were remembered and celebrated, passed down in stories and songs. Even when resistance ended in tragic loss, it reinforced a collective spirit of pride, that the Subanen were not passive victims but active defenders of their land. The defenders bore immense psychological and social burdens. Every skirmish risked the annihilation of entire families, and every decision to resist tribute meant gambling the future of the community. Yet, their choices also served as powerful examples of courage, instilling the younger generations the idea that their rivers and forests were sacred legacies worth protecting. The Subanen's resistance was rarely organized as large-scale warfare. Unlike the centralized sultanates with their fleets and armies, the Subanen fought localized battles, often with small bands of warriors defending a single village or valley. These confrontations might appear minor in the grand scope of Mindanao's history, but for the communities involved, they were decisive struggles for survival. Timuays became not only leaders, but also tacticians. They adapted their defense to the geography of their settlements. Villages built on ridges or cliffs were easier to defend, requiring raiders to ascend narrow paths under a hail of arrows. Fortified fences made of bamboo and wood, sharpened into spikes, ringed many settlements. Watchtowers were erected to scan the rivers for approaching boats. Subanen warriors often struck at night or used the cover of the forest, relying on stealth rather than brute force. Their poisoned arrows and familiarity with hidden trails turned the environment into a weapon. Despite these efforts, the Subanen's capacity for defense was limited. Larger raiding fleets could overwhelm even the most fortified villages. Oral accounts tell of communities that fought valiantly, but were eventually massacred, their defenders cut down, and their survivors enslaved. Yet, the very act of resistance carried symbolic weight. For the Subanen, to fight, even in the face of overwhelming odds, meant affirming their right to remain on their land. These stories of bravery were preserved in ritual storytelling, turning loss into a lesson and martyrdom into inspiration. Such defenses also shaped Subanen social life. Boys were taught early to handle spears and bows, while girls learned to hide and flee into the forest during raids. Community rituals before planting and harvest often included prayers for protection against raiders, blending the spiritual with the martial. Warfare was not glorified. It was a burden and a necessity. Yet, it became integrated into Subanen identity, reinforcing the idea that survival demanded both vigilance and unity. Over time, the stories of those who resisted raids and defended their riverine settlements became central to the Subanen's collective memory. Oral traditions preserve the names of Timuays who refused to pay tribute, who gathered warriors to repel incursions, and who sacrificed their lives to protect their people. These stories were recited during rituals, retold in family gatherings, and embedded in the cultural fabric of Subanen society. Martyrdom, in particular, became a powerful motif. Communities that had been annihilated in the course of resistance were not forgotten. Instead, they were revered as symbols of bravery. Their loss served as a warning of the dangers of resistance, but also as a reminder that freedom and identity came at great cost. In this way, the trauma of defeat was transformed into cultural resilience. Each generation inherited not only the pain of their ancestors, but also their courage. These stories also served practical purposes. By preserving accounts of raids, strategies of defense, and tales of both victory and defeat, oral traditions became a kind of historical manual. They taught the young how to recognize signs of approaching raiders, when to fight and when to flee, and how to survive exile in the mountains. They also reinforced the role of the Timuays as both protector and moral leader, ensuring that the authority of chieftains rested not only on tradition, but also on demonstrated bravery. Even as Spanish colonial influence grew in the 17th century, the memory of resistance against the Moro Sultanates remained a defining aspect of Subanen identity. It underscored their determination to endure in a world dominated by more powerful forces. For the Subanen, defense was never simply about holding territory. It was about affirming who they were as a people. Their rivers, forests, and mountains were not just resources, but sacred inheritances. To resist was to honor the past and preserve the possibility of a future in which the Subanen spirit could continue to thrive. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Subanen found themselves not only under pressure from the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao, but also caught in the rising conflict between the Moro powers and the Spanish colonizers. The Spaniards, having consolidated control in Luzon and Visayas, set their sights on Mindanao and Sulu, determined to extend their empire, spread Christianity, and suppress the Muslim sultanates that resisted their authority. Fortresses were constructed along strategic coastal points, including Zamboanga, which became a linchpin of Spanish power in western Mindanao. The Spanish justified their presence by claiming to protect the pagan and subjugated peoples like the Subanen from Moro enslavement. In reality, this protection was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the establishment of Spanish garrisons and missions did provide some measure of security for displaced Subanen who sought refuge near colonial forts. Communities living close to Spanish-controlled areas could experience a reprieve from the constant threat of raids, as Moro fleets were wary of direct confrontation with fortified strongholds. On the other hand, Spanish protection came at a steep cost. Submission to colonial authority, conversion to Christianity, and service as auxiliaries in Spanish campaigns. Many Subanen were compelled to supply labor for building forts, cultivating lands for colonial officials, or even fighting in expeditions against Moro strongholds. The Subanen thus found themselves between two great powers, each demanding allegiance. The Sultanates saw them as tributaries to be exploited, while the Spaniards viewed them as potential allies or converts who could be mobilized against their Muslim adversaries. For a people already traumatized by centuries of raiding and displacement, this new political landscape brought both opportunities and burdens. Aligning with the Spanish could mean temporary relief from Moro raids, but it also meant becoming entangled in a larger conflict that had little to do with their own aspirations for autonomy. This dilemma forced Subanen leaders to make difficult choices. Some communities moved closer to Spanish garrisons, accepting baptism and colonial oversight in exchange for security. Others withdrew deeper into the mountains, preferring isolation to submission under either power. Still others attempted to balance between the two, paying tribute to the sultanates when threatened, yet occasionally cooperating with the Spanish for survival. Whatever the choice, the Subanen remained at the margins of a contest between two powerful forces whose struggles would shape their destiny for generations. For the Subanen, living between the Moro Sultanates and Spanish colonizers was like walking a dangerous tightrope. On one side were the tribute collectors of Sulu and Maguindanao, demanding rice, forest products, or captives as payments of submission. On the other side were Spanish officials and missionaries, pressing for loyalty, conversion, and service. Neither side represented true freedom. Instead, the Subanen were forced to constantly negotiate their position, adapting strategies of survival that often meant shifting allegiances or feigning compliance to whichever power was closest. Spanish missionaries described the Subanen as timid yet industrious, noting how they were wary of both Muslims and colonizers alike. In many instances, Spanish records claim that Subanen willingly sought the protection of the cross. Yet oral histories suggest a more complicated reality. Many Subanen feigned conversion or compliance simply to avoid Spanish reprisals, while quietly maintaining their traditional beliefs and rituals in secret. Likewise, tribute payments to the Moro Sultanates were often made reluctantly, with communities offering minimal goods while concealing their best harvests in hidden mountain fields. Caught between these pressures, Subanen society developed survival mechanisms rooted in flexibility. Villages were often built in hard-to-reach locations, allowing quick escape routes if either Spanish recruiters or Moro raiders approached. Community scouts were tasked with monitoring the movement of both forces, ensuring that villagers could flee into the forest before being caught. In this way, Subanen resilience manifested not only in open resistance, but also in subtle strategies of evasion and adaptation. The burden on families was immense. Young men were at constant risk of conscription by Moro raiding fleets as rowers, by Spanish garrisons as auxiliaries, or even by both at different times. Women faced the threat of enslavement from raids, but also the cultural pressure of colonial missions that sought to alter family structures and impose Christian marriage practices. The tension between preserving their traditions and surviving under dual pressures became a defining feature of Subanen life in this period. Ultimately, this precarious balancing act eroded their autonomy. Whether paying tribute to the Sultanates or laboring under Spanish recruiters, the Subanen were rarely free to live as they once had. Yet, in their determination to endure, they found ways to preserve fragments of their culture, weaving resilience into their daily struggles. The Subanen's position in the 17th and 18th centuries was a precarious one, but it also demonstrated their extraordinary resilience. By refusing to be fully absorbed by either the Sultanates or the Spanish, they carved out a fragile but enduring space for themselves in the margins of Mindanao's history. They adapted their settlements, rituals, and leadership structures to withstand constant external pressures, ensuring that their identity as Subanen would survive even as the world around them changed. The dual pressures of Moro and Spanish domination reshaped their worldview. The Timuays, already transformed into a protector during the era of raids, now became negotiators and mediators with external powers. Some Timuays agreed to cooperate with Spanish authorities, guiding soldiers through the mountains or serving as intermediaries with other villages. Others, however, aligned temporarily with the Moro Sultanates, offering tribute in exchange for protection against rival groups. These decisions were rarely ideological. They were pragmatic choices for survival in a landscape dominated by stronger forces. Yet through all this, the Subanen retained their cultural anchors. Rituals like the bucklog continued, sometimes performed in secrecy as a way of reaffirming community bonds. Oral traditions preserve the memory of both the horrors of slavery and the courage of resistance, ensuring that new generations would not forget their history. Even under Spanish pressure to abandon their beliefs, the Subanen quietly maintained their spiritual practices, blending Christian forms with indigenous rituals to preserve continuity. The precarious position of being caught between two powers was not one of passivity. It was a form of strategic resilience, where survival depended on careful negotiation, adaptation, and endurance. The Subanen neither fully submitted to the Moro Sultanates nor wholly embraced Spanish colonialism. Instead, they endured in the spaces in between, surviving in exile, defending their culture, and asserting their right to exist as a people despite centuries of domination. This resilience would prove critical in the years to come, as Spanish campaigns intensified in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and as Moro resistance stiffened against colonial incursions. The Subanen would once again be drawn into conflicts not of their own making. Yet, their history of survival in the face of overwhelming odds prepared them for the long struggle ahead. As the Spanish Empire expanded its reach across the Philippine archipelago, Mindanao and Sulu became persistent challenges. Unlike the Visayas or Luzon, the South remained dominated by powerful Moro Sultanates that resisted both conquest and conversion. To assert their authority, the Spanish established a chain of fortresses along strategic points of the Zamboanga Peninsula and surrounding islands. Among these, the most notable was the fort in Zamboanga itself, later named Real Fuerza de Nuestra Señora del Pilar de Zaragoza, Fort Pilar. This fort, along with smaller garrisons in places like Timuays and Misamis, became centers of Spanish military campaigns against Moro fleets and bases for missionary expansion. For the Subanen, who had long been targets of Moro raids, these fortifications represented a paradox. On the one hand, Spanish presence in coastal zones provided a shield against the worst of raiding expeditions. Subanen villages near these forts often experienced a reduction in slave-taking, as raiders avoided heavily defended areas patrolled by Spanish soldiers and their allies. Some Subanen even relocated closer to these garrisons, hoping to benefit from the umbrella of protection offered by colonial power. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits and Augustinians, took advantage of this situation, establishing missions and encouraging displaced Subanen to settle in reductions, mission towns. On the other hand, Spanish protection was far from benevolent. To live near the forts meant submission to colonial demands. Families were pressured to accept baptism, abandon their rituals, and conform to Catholic practices. Moreover, labor obligations weighed heavily on Subanen men, who were often conscripted to help build fortifications, row galleys, or serve as auxiliaries in Spanish expeditions against the Moro. In effect, the Subanen traded one form of domination for another, escaping enslavement by the Sultanates only to fall under colonial servitude. Spanish officials framed this arrangement as liberation, rescuing pagans from Moro bondage. But Subanen oral traditions, when juxtaposed with colonial reports, tell a different story. They recall the resentment of communities forced to leave their ancestral lands to live in mission towns, where surveillance was constant and freedom curtailed. Rituals like the bucklaw were often discouraged or outright banned, forcing Subanen to practice their traditions in secret. Thus, while Spanish forts blunted the reach of Moro raiders, they simultaneously eroded Subanen autonomy and cultural expression. By the 18th century, the Spanish-Moro conflict had escalated into a cycle of raids, counter-raids, and punitive campaigns that engulfed much of Mindanao. Subanen communities, caught between the two powers, were inevitably dragged into the conflict. Spanish authorities frequently recruited Subanen men as auxiliaries, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain for expeditions into the interior. These recruits were tasked with guiding Spanish soldiers through forests and mountains, carrying supplies, or serving as scouts against Moro strongholds. In some cases, they were forced into direct combat, fighting wars that were not their own. The irony of this situation was not lost on the Subanen. Having fled into the mountains to escape Moro raids, they now found themselves compelled by the Spanish to march back into contested zones. Oral accounts recall instances where Subanen auxiliaries faced the bitter prospect of fighting against their own kin who had been enslaved and absorbed into Moro communities. In such cases, loyalty was fractured and survival demanded painful choices. Meanwhile, Moro forces continued to raid Spanish-aligned settlements, and Subanen living near garrisons remained targets of retaliation. The Spanish forts were strongholds, but they could not shield every surrounding community. Raiders adapted by attacking isolated villages, seizing captives, and disappearing into the sea before Spanish troops could respond. Thus, Subanen lives remained precarious, their survival hinging on constant vigilance, quick escape routes, and fragile alliances. The Spanish campaigns also disrupted traditional economic patterns. Forced labor obligations drained manpower from farming, leading to food shortages in upland villages. Trade networks were disrupted as movement became dangerous amid the constant warfare. Families were split, some members forced into Spanish service, others captured by Moro raiders, and others fleeing into the forest. The Subanen, already weakened by centuries of displacement, were further fragmented by this colonial war that consumed their homeland. Yet even in these conditions, they found ways to adapt. Some villages avoided both powers altogether by retreating deeper into remote areas, choosing self-sufficiency over entanglement. Others mastered the art of temporary allegiance, shifting between Spanish and Moro as circumstances dictated. These strategies were not betrayals, but necessities, born of a determination to survive when larger forces offered no real refuge. Amid the turbulence of Spanish-Moro wars, the Subanen developed survival strategies that reflected both pragmatism and cultural resilience. One of the most significant was the strengthening of communal solidarity. Families relied heavily on kinship ties, pooling resources to withstand food shortages and sharing labor to rebuild villages destroyed by raids or campaigns. The Timuays' role as protector and negotiator became even more critical, with chieftains acting as intermediaries between colonial officials, missionaries, and their people. By carefully navigating these relationships, some Timuays secured temporary reprieves for their communities, though always at the risk of betrayal. Villages also adapted their physical structures. Settlements were increasingly hidden, built in remote mountain valleys or along concealed ridges. Paths were camouflaged and lookout points established to spot approaching enemies. Portable farming techniques, planting crops in scattered, concealed plots rather than large, open fields, allowed communities to feed themselves without drawing attention. These strategies reflected a broader pattern. The Subanen prioritized survival through invisibility, learning to thrive in the margins rather than in contested centers. Culturally, the Subanen clung to their traditions even as both Moro and Spanish forces sought to erase or absorb them. Rituals like bucklog persisted, though often adapted to new realities. Where once it had been primarily a thanksgiving for harvests, it became a ritual of survival, performed after safe returns from flight, after successful escapes from raids, or in memory of those lost. Oral traditions likewise expanded, incorporating new stories of colonial encounters into the old cycles of myth and history. These narratives ensured that children grew up understanding not only their ancestral past, but also the ongoing struggle against domination. Despite centuries of marginalization, the Subanen's spirit endured. Neither Moro raiding nor Spanish colonization succeeded in fully subjugating them. Instead, both forces unintentionally reinforced the Subanen's determination to preserve their way of life. By adapting strategies of retreat, concealment, and resilience, the Subanen demonstrated that survival was not only physical, but also cultural. They endured by refusing to let go of their identity, even when living in exile, hiding in mountains, or balancing precariously between rival powers. The 19th century would bring further challenges as Spanish campaigns intensified under military leaders like General Valeriano Weyler, and as the global currents of trade and colonialism reshaped Mindanao. Yet, the Subanen's history up to this point had already forged in them a tradition of resilience. They had survived centuries of raids, displacement, and forced alliances, and through it all, they retained their cultural soul. Their story by this stage was no longer just one of survival and exile. It was also one of defiance, of insisting that even in the shadows of great powers, a people could endure, resist, and remember who they were. By the 18th century, Moro raiding reached new levels of intensity, driven by the growing demand for slaves in regional trade networks and the continued resistance of the sultanates against Spanish incursions. Slave-taking had long been a feature of the Moro economy, but the 1700s saw its expansion into a highly organized system. The Subanen, already weakened by centuries of displacement and caught in the crossfire of colonial wars, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. The Tazig Marinao and Maguindanao raiding fleets grew more sophisticated, armed with fast-moving vintas and equipped with small cannons known as lantakas. These fleets could strike suddenly along the coasts of Mindanao, then push inland via rivers that had once been the lifeblood of Subanen culture. Villages that had clung to the riverbanks were particularly exposed. Scouts would first assess the size of settlement, and then a raiding party would descend, overwhelming defenders with superior weapons and numbers. The goal was rarely wholesale slaughter. Captives were more valuable alive. Men were shackled and forced into labor or military service. Women were enslaved for household work or concubinage, and children were sold in distant markets. Spanish records from the period emphasized the ferocity of these raids, often describing heathen villages burned to the ground, though oral histories add deeper layers of tragedy. Subanen families recall the terror of sudden attacks at night, the cries of children carried off, and the despair of parents left behind. Survivors spoke of entire villages being emptied, leaving only ashes where once there had been farms and homes. The trauma was compounded by the frequency of raids. These were not rare events, but recurrent shocks that left little time for recovery. To escape this terror, many more Subanen communities abandoned their riverine homelands entirely. Where earlier centuries had seen gradual movement into the mountains, the 18th century witnessed a mass exodus. Upland settlements multiplied, carved into remote valleys and high ridges. The Subanen's transformation from riverine people to mountain dwellers was no longer just a survival tactic, but had become a defining characteristic of their society. In effect, centuries of raids had reshaped their very identity. The dawn of the 19th century did not bring relief. Instead, the raiding system reached its height, intertwined with a broader struggle between the Spanish Empire and the Moro Sultanates. The Subanen, positioned geographically in the Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis regions, remained at the center of this conflict. Spanish forts offered partial security, but beyond the immediate reach of garrisons, the Subanen were still targets. During this period, Moro raiders adapted their strategies to counter Spanish patrols. They struck deeper into the interior, targeting isolated villages far from colonial protection. The Subanen's upland refuges, once relatively safe, were increasingly exposed. Oral traditions tell of raids that scaled mountain paths, forcing even hidden settlements to flee further into the wilderness. Communities learned to live in constant mobility, building temporary houses, cultivating hidden fields, and abandoning them at the first sign of danger. Spanish officials, frustrated by their inability to stamp out raiding, escalated their campaigns. Leaders such as General Valeriano Weyler in the late 19th century conducted aggressive expeditions into Moro territories, building new forts and launching retaliatory attacks. While these campaigns were aimed at the Sultanates, their collateral effects fell heavily on the Subanen. Forced labor to support Spanish operations drained communities, and punitive expeditions often swept indiscriminately through upland areas, punishing Subanen villages accused of harboring or aiding raiders. Thus, the Subanen endured violence from both sides. From the Moro Sultanates came slave raids and tribute demands. From the Spanish came forced labor, displacement, and the imposition of foreign authority. Caught in this cycle, the Subanen perfected strategies of avoidance. Villages became semi-nomadic, moving frequently to avoid detection. Families buried food stores in forest caches, ensuring sustenance even if forced to flee. Scouts and lookouts became integral to daily life, watching rivers and trails for the approach of either raiders or colonial troops. By the mid-19th century, the Subanen had become synonymous with marginalization. Spanish officials often described them as backward or wild tribes, failing to recognize that their isolation was not inherent, but the product of centuries of violence. Their retreat into the mountains was less a rejection of progress than a testament to survival in a hostile landscape. The intensification of raids during the 18th and 19th centuries left deep scars on Subanen society. Generations grew up knowing only a life of vigilance, exile, and loss. Families were fractured by captivity, with kin sold into distant lands, their fates unknown. Oral traditions kept their memory alive, with stories of lost brothers or sisters who had been carried off by raiders, sometimes resurfacing in tales of distant Moro households or markets in Borneo. For the Subanen, slavery was not an abstract fear, but a lived reality woven into family histories. This trauma shaped their worldview and culture. Rituals took on new layers of meaning, with prayers for protection and remembrance of the dead becoming central themes. The bucklog ceremony, once a thanksgiving for prosperity, increasingly became a communal act of survival, celebrating endurance after raids or mourning those who never returned. Songs and chants recorded these sorrows, ensuring that the pain of displacement was never forgotten. Exile into the mountains also reinforced the Subanen's identity as a people of resilience. Though forced away from the fertile valleys that had once sustained them, they developed a culture of adaptation. Root crops, forest gathering, and hidden agriculture replaced rice fields. Fortified villages and secret trails became essential. Their leaders, the Timuays, evolved into guardians not only of tradition, but also of defense and strategy. Despite centuries of marginalization, the Subanen did not vanish. Instead, they endured by redefining themselves in exile. Their story during the height of raiding was not only one of suffering, but also of persistence. They learned to live with mobility, to value secrecy and solidarity, and to turn memory into a tool of resilience. Their survival through the darkest periods of Mindanao's raiding economy ensured that their culture, though battered, would continue to flow like the rivers from which they drew their name. By the close of the 19th century, as Spanish colonial rule faltered under the weight of internal revolts and the coming of American power, the Subanen remained in the mountains, scattered, marginalized, but unbroken. The centuries of raids and displacement had not erased their identity. Instead, it had forged a culture of endurance that would carry them into a new era of foreign domination. By the late 18th, and especially in the 19th century, the Spanish crown intensified its war against the Moro Sultanates. Frustrated by centuries of coastal raids that disrupted commerce and threatened their tenuous colonial hold on the Philippines, the Spaniards shifted from defensive posturing to aggressive counteroffensives. This shift in strategy marked a turning point not only for the Moro powers, but also for the Subanen people, who once again found themselves in the crosshairs of a conflict that was never truly theirs. Spanish leaders such as Governor General Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera in the 17th century and later General Valeriano Weyler in the 19th century spearheaded punitive campaigns deep into Moro-controlled territories. Forts were reinforced, gunboats patrolled the seas, and expeditions marched into the interior. The Spanish rationale was simple: weaken the sultanates by destroying their economic base and breaking their slave raiding networks. Yet in practice, these campaigns often swept indiscriminately through upland areas, punishing any community suspected of aiding or sheltering Moro raiders. For the Subanen, who lived in the overlapping zones between Spanish and Moro influence, this was disastrous. Their remote mountain settlements, once safe havens, became suspected refuges of Moro allies. Spanish patrols raided villages, accusing them of harboring fugitives or refusing tribute. Fields were burned, food confiscated, and families forced into reductions near garrisons. The irony was bitter. While the Subanen had long suffered as victims of Moro raids, they were now punished as potential collaborators. The devastation wrought by these campaigns deepened the Subanen's displacement. Entire valleys were emptied as families fled deeper into forests, avoiding both Moro raiders and Spanish soldiers. Survival required even greater mobility and secrecy. Oral traditions recall this era as one of relentless persecution, where no path, whether toward the coast or the mountains, was safe. The Subanen's ancient riverside homelands were now completely abandoned, replaced by hidden upland settlements that emphasized defense and invisibility above all else. Spanish expansion in western Mindanao was not limited to military campaigns. Alongside forts and patrols, missionaries played a crucial role in the colonial project. Jesuits, Augustinians, and later Recollects moved into Subanen territories, often under the protection of garrisons, to civilize and convert the indigenous population. Mission towns were established, where displaced Subanen were resettled under close watch. For many Subanen, entering these towns was less a choice than a necessity. Constant raids and Spanish patrols left them with few safe options. In reductions, they were offered temporary protection from Moro raiders, but in exchange, they were subjected to the heavy hand of colonial assimilation. Children were baptized and taught Christian prayers. Rituals like the Bucklaw were suppressed or reinterpreted through Catholic festivals, and the authority of the Timuays was undermined in favor of priests and Spanish officials. Yet assimilation was never complete. Many Subanen outwardly complied with colonial expectations while quietly maintaining their traditions. Ritual specialists, the Balian, continued to lead ceremonies in secret, and oral traditions kept alive the memory of their riverine ancestors. Even in mission towns, Subanen identity persisted beneath the surface. Families taught their children about their history of exile and resistance, ensuring that their cultural roots would not be erased. Still, The cost of life in reductions was high. Disease spread easily in crowded settlements. Food shortages were common, and forced labor drained communities of strength. Subanen men were compelled to row Spanish ships, haul timber, or serve as porters in military campaigns. Women were often pressed into domestic service for priests or colonial officials. The mission towns may have offered temporary relief from raiders, but they also represented a new form of captivity, one enforced by priests and soldiers rather than Moro fleets. The Subanen thus faced a tragic dilemma: remain in the mountains and risk raids from both Moro and Spanish forces, or submit to reductions and sacrifice their autonomy. Neither path promised freedom. Both represented the ongoing erosion of their ancestral way of life. The 19th century was a period of unrelenting pressure for the Subanen, but it also revealed their remarkable capacity for resilience. Caught between the fire of Moro raids and the cross of Spanish colonialism, they endured by adapting their strategies of survival. Those who remained in the mountains perfected techniques of concealment, building villages in inaccessible terrain, scattering fields to avoid detection, and maintaining networks of kin who could provide refuge when communities were uprooted. Those who entered mission towns, meanwhile, learned the art of dual identity, outwardly practicing Catholicism while quietly preserving ancestral rituals in secret. The Subanen also developed a keen sense of political navigation. Timuays became skilled negotiators, bargaining with Spanish officials for reduced labor obligations or offering tribute to Moro emissaries when necessary. Survival required constant calculation: who held power at a given moment, and what gesture of compliance would ensure the safety of the community. This pragmatism, though often criticized by outsiders as weakness, was in truth a profound expression of resilience. The Subanen understood that their strength lay not in military might, but in the ability to endure, adapt, and persist. At the cultural level, resilience was expressed through memory. Oral traditions continued to recount the trauma of raids, the courage of defenders, and the sacrifices of ancestors. Songs and chants were infused with sorrow, but also with pride, affirming that the Subanen had not been erased despite centuries of domination. The bucklog ritual, though suppressed in many areas, survived in modified forms, a testament to the people's refusal to let go of their spiritual heritage. As the century drew to a close, the Spanish Empire itself weakened under internal revolts and external pressures, culminating in its collapse by the end of the 1890s. For the Subanen, this brought no immediate liberation. Yet, their endurance through centuries of dual oppression had already proven that they could survive the rise and fall of empires. Their resilience lay not in conquest, but in persistence, in the determination to remain Subanen despite everything. By the late 19th century, the Spanish had established a more consistent military presence across the Zamboanga Peninsula. Forts such as Real Flourished and Nuestra Señora del Pilar de Zaragoza in Zamboanga, and smaller outposts in Misamis and Timuays stood as bastions of colonial authority. Yet beyond the immediate shadow of these strongholds, Subanen villages still faced the dual threats of Moro raids and Spanish punitive expeditions. In this turbulent frontier, the role of the Timuay expanded beyond governance and ritual leadership into that of war chieftain and defender. Oral histories from Subanen communities tell of Timuays who armed themselves with spears, bolos, and shields, organizing watchmen and warriors to repel raiding parties. They were not generals in the European sense, but guardians of their kin, strategists who used knowledge of terrain to ambush enemies or guide their people into safe refuges. Some Timuays became legends for their ability to stand against overwhelming odds. Their names, though absent in Spanish records, lived on in Subanen chants and narratives as proof that their people did not surrender passively. The tactics of resistance were rooted in ingenuity rather than force. Poison arrows made from forest plants turned even small-scale skirmishes deadly for raiders unaccustomed to such weapons. Villages were fortified with bamboo palisades, concealed spike traps, and alarm systems using bamboo clappers to alert families of approaching danger. These measures rarely stopped large-scale assaults, but they bought precious time for women and children to flee into the mountains. In this way, the Timuays' leadership embodied both resistance and protection, balancing the duty to fight with the responsibility to preserve life. Spanish officials occasionally recognized these defiant communities in their reports, describing them as stubborn pagans who refused conversion and tribute. But from the Subanen perspective, resistance was not rebellion. It was survival, a defense of ancestral rivers and forests that had been theirs for generations. Each stand, no matter how small, reaffirmed their dignity and identity in the face of forces that sought to erase them. Resistance during this period was rarely coordinated on a large scale. The Subanen, dispersed across mountains and valleys, could not muster armies capable of matching either Moro fleets or Spanish garrisons. Instead, their defiance took the form of localized, small-scale acts of courage. A single village might refuse tribute collectors, forcing raiders to retreat after losing men in ambushes. Another settlement might protect escapees from slavery, risking Spanish retaliation for harboring so-called fugitives. These acts, though modest compared to grand battles recorded in colonial chronicles, carried immense symbolic power within the community. Stories passed down in oral tradition highlight such moments of courage. In one tale, a Timuay rallied his warriors to ambush a raiding party on a river bend, using poisoned arrows from concealed positions. Though outnumbered, the defenders inflicted enough casualties to drive the raiders back, saving their families from capture. In another, women disguised themselves as warriors, banging gongs and shouting from the forest to create the illusion of reinforcements, forcing Moro attackers to retreat. These stories reveal the creativity and resourcefulness that underpinned Subanen resistance. Spanish colonial reports, meanwhile, acknowledged the difficulty of subduing upland groups. Expeditions into the mountains were costly and often inconclusive, as Subanen villages melted away into the forests long before soldiers arrived. The terrain itself favored the defenders. Steep ridges, hidden trails, and dense forests provided natural fortifications that frustrated Spanish campaigns. This elusiveness was a form of defiance. By refusing to be pinned down, the Subanen denied colonizers full control over their lands. Such localized resistance was not only about physical defense, but also about autonomy. By refusing tribute, by sheltering their rituals, and by retelling their stories of bravery, the Subanen affirmed their independence. Even if they could not repel every raid or avoid every colonial incursion, they maintained a spirit of refusal. They refused to let either Moro or Spanish power dictate the full terms of their existence. That refusal, subtle yet enduring, was itself an act of resistance. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Subanen resistance in the late Spanish era was its preservation in collective memory. The Subanen did not rely on written chronicles. Their history lived in stories, songs, and rituals that carried the voices of their ancestors across generations. In these oral traditions, heroes emerged, Timuays who defied raiders, families who outwitted captors, and villages that stood their ground despite overwhelming odds. These figures were celebrated not only for their victories, but also for their sacrifices. Even those who perished in defense of their people became martyrs whose memory fortified the will of the living. The cultural significance of resistance cannot be overstated. In a world where external powers sought to redefine their lives through slavery, tribute, forced labor, or conversion, the Subanen reclaimed dignity through memory. The bucklog ritual, already transformed by centuries of exile, now incorporated themes of remembrance and defiance. When communities gathered to dance on the resonant bamboo platforms, they invoked not only thanksgiving for survival, but also the memory of those who had fallen. Each step echoed with both grief and pride, affirming that the Subanen spirit was unbroken. This culture of defiance extended into everyday life. Songs sung during planting and harvest recalled the dangers of raids, embedding vigilance into agricultural rhythms. Children grew up hearing tales of ancestral courage, shaping their understanding of identity not as victims but as survivors. Even submission, when it occurred, was reframed as strategic compliance, a temporary measure until autonomy could be reclaimed. In this way, the Subanen narrative of resistance became not only a historical record, but also a guiding philosophy. By the time Spanish rule in the Philippines began to crumble in the late 19th century, the Subanen had endured centuries of pressure without losing their identity. They had been displaced, enslaved, and forced into exile, yet they remained Subanen, rooted in memory, bound by ritual, and sustained by the stories of resistance. Their courage in the late Spanish era, though often unseen in colonial records, lived vibrantly in their own traditions, ensuring that future generations would inherit both the trauma and the strength of their ancestors. By the latter decades of the 19th century, Spanish rule in the Philippines was faltering. Years of costly campaigns against the Moro Sultanates had drained resources, and uprisings in Luzon and the Visayas signaled that colonial control was crumbling. In Mindanao, the Subanen watched from the mountains as the balance of power shifted yet again. For centuries they had endured raids, tribute demands, and the encroachment of both Moro and Spanish authority. Now, as Spanish dominance weakened, new uncertainties emerged. The Subanen were not direct participants in the great revolutionary movements of 1896, but they were not untouched by the turmoil. Spanish garrisons in Zamboanga and Misamis were increasingly undermanned, leaving surrounding areas vulnerable. Some Subanen communities near the forts experienced a loosening of colonial pressure as officials focused on larger revolts elsewhere. Tribute demands and forced labor declined in intensity, giving some upland settlements space to breathe. Yet this relief was tempered by fear. With Spanish patrols reduced, Moro raiding parties again moved more freely, striking vulnerable villages in the interior. At the same time, Spanish missionaries, recognizing the fragility of their position, redoubled efforts to Christianize upland groups. For the Subanen, this meant renewed pressure to abandon rituals like the bucklog, which priests condemned as pagan superstition. Some families, weary of centuries of conflict, accepted baptism and the stability of mission towns. Others resisted, practicing their traditions in secret. This divergence created internal tensions. Families split between those who embraced Catholicism for survival and those who clung to ancestral ways. As the 1890s closed, Spain's grip on the Philippines finally broke under the combined force of local revolts and foreign intervention. The Subanen, long accustomed to living between larger powers, now faced the dawn of another transformation, the arrival of a new colonial master in the form of the United States. The fall of Spain did not mean liberation. It meant yet another foreign force laying claim to their lands and lives. The defeat of Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898 brought the Philippines under American rule. For the Subanen, the transition was swift yet bewildering. Spanish forts in Zamboanga were surrendered, and American troops established their own garrisons. The rhetoric of the new colonizers was different. Where Spain had justified its rule through religion, the Americans spoke of benevolent assimilation, promising to modernize, educate, and integrate the peoples of Mindanao into a larger Philippine state. Yet beneath this language lay familiar patterns of control. The Americans inherited the long-standing conflict with the Moro Sultanates, launching campaigns to subdue them in the early 1900s. Once again, the Subanen were caught between contending forces. Though not the primary targets of American operations, their lands became transit routes, their villages subject to new forms of administration, and their people drawn into the colonial bureaucracy. One major change came in the form of surveys and land policies. The Americans introduced cadastral mapping and land titling systems, concepts alien to the Subanen's communal and customary land use. For generations, rivers, forests, and fields had been shared within kinship networks, governed by the authority of the Timuays and guided by ancestral memory. Now, with the stroke of a pen, these lands were declared public property unless formal titles could be produced, a requirement most Subanen communities could not meet. This legal maneuver dispossessed many Subanen of their ancestral domains, opening their lands to logging companies, plantations, and Christian settlers encouraged by the colonial government. The cultural impact was equally profound. American schools introduced English, literacy, and Western norms, often at the expense of indigenous traditions. While some Subanen youths gained opportunities to learn and interact with the broader world, others experienced this education as erasure, a deliberate attempt to reshape their identity. Rituals, oral traditions, and the authority of the Timuays were increasingly marginalized. What Spanish friars had attempted through religious pressure, the Americans pursued through law and education. The transition from Spanish to American rule left the Subanen in a state of deep uncertainty. On one hand, the collapse of Spanish power seemed to promise relief from centuries of tribute, forced labor, and suppression of rituals. The departure of friars and soldiers loosened colonial constraints, at least temporarily. On the other hand, the arrival of the Americans introduced new challenges that were less overtly violent, but equally disruptive. Where Spain had raided villages and burned fields, America expropriated land through legal decrees and enticed settlers into Subanen territories. Caught in this new system, the Subanen once again adapted. Some families moved deeper into the mountains, maintaining their independence by avoiding American authorities altogether. Others engaged cautiously, sending children to schools or participating in local councils introduced by the colonial regime. The Timuays continued to play a central role, now negotiating not only with Moro emissaries and Spanish priests, but also with American officials. His authority was diminished in formal terms, yet in practice, the Subanen still looked to him for guidance in navigating an uncertain world. At the cultural level, resilience endured. The bucklog ritual persisted, though sometimes reframed as a folk festival to evade colonial scrutiny. Oral traditions continued to preserve the memory of raids, resistance, and exile. The Subanen identity, already forged in the crucible of centuries of displacement, adapted once more. Their survival was less about confrontation with the Americans than about persistence in the face of gradual assimilation. Thus, the collapse of Spanish power and the arrival of American colonialism marked both an end and a beginning. It ended one cycle of oppression defined by raids, tribute, and forced missions, but it began another era of dispossession through law, settlement, and cultural assimilation. For the Subanen, it was yet another chapter in a long history of being caught between larger forces, always marginalized, yet always enduring. Their uncertainty reflected not weakness, but the reality of a people navigating survival in a world perpetually defined by powers beyond their control. When the Americans established colonial control in the Philippines in the early 20th century, they introduced sweeping legal frameworks that redefined land ownership. Unlike the Spanish, whose control had often relied on tribute and missions, the Americans sought to integrate Mindanao into a modernized colonial economy. Central to this project were land laws that required communities to present legal titles or survey documents to claim ownership of land. To the Subanen, whose land tenure was communal and based on custom rather than written documents, this requirement was alien and devastating. For centuries, Subanen society recognized land as ancestral, belonging not to individuals, but to families and communities linked by kinship. Fields, rivers, and forests were shared under the stewardship of the Timuays, who ensured balance and fairness in use. There were no paper deeds, no cadastral surveys, only memory and oral tradition to record boundaries. Yet under American law, such customs were deemed invalid. Lands not backed by legal titles were classified as public domain, allowing the colonial government to redistribute them to corporations, settlers, or missions. This legal dispossession struck at the heart of Subanen identity. Fertile valleys that had once been cultivated collectively were suddenly open to logging companies or plantation owners from Luzon and Visayas. Migrants, encouraged by colonial authorities, began settling in Zamboanga and Misamis Occidental, often occupying lands that Subanen had used for generations. The Subanen found themselves pushed further into marginal uplands, not by slave raids this time, but by surveyors, bureaucrats, and settlers who claimed legal authority over their ancestral domains. The irony was bitter. While the Subanen had endured centuries of violence and exile to preserve their connection to the land, they were now dispossessed by signatures on documents written in a language they could not read. The displacement was quieter than the Moro raids, less bloody than Spanish punitive campaigns, but no less destructive. It undermined the very foundation of Subanen society, their relationship with land and river, the spaces that defined their culture and sustenance. Alongside land policies, the Americans introduced systems of education and governance that aimed to assimilate indigenous groups into a new colonial order. Public schools were established, teaching English, arithmetic, and Western history. For many Subanen children, this was their first exposure to formal education. On the surface, schooling offered opportunities, literacy, access to jobs, and the ability to navigate the wider colonial society. Yet beneath this promise lay the steady erosion of Subanen cultural traditions. American teachers often dismissed indigenous rituals as backward superstitions. The bucklog was tolerated in some areas as a native custom, but increasingly reframed as entertainment rather than sacred ritual. The role of the Balian spiritual leader was marginalized as schools emphasized Christianity and Western medicine. Even the authority of the Timuays was undercut as American-appointed local officials, often from non-Subanen backgrounds, were installed as leaders under the colonial bureaucracy. This cultural displacement was compounded by economic dependency, as land was lost to settlers and corporations. Many Subanen were forced to work as laborers on plantations or in logging camps. Wages were meager, conditions harsh, and exploitation rampant. Where once they had cultivated their own rice fields and root crops, they now found themselves dependent on cash wages and markets controlled by outsiders. The cycle of poverty deepened, making communities even more vulnerable to manipulation by colonial administrators and settlers. Yet, even amid these pressures, the Subanen found ways to resist cultural erasure. Families continued to pass down oral traditions in secret, telling stories of ancestral rivers and the struggles against raiders and colonizers. Rituals were held discreetly in remote areas, away from the gaze of missionaries or teachers. The Bucklog endured not just as a festival, but as a defiant act of memory, a reminder that the Subanen spirit could not be extinguished by foreign laws or schools. In this way, the Subanen transformed adaptation into resistance. Outwardly, many engaged with colonial institutions, sending children to school, working in plantations, but inwardly, they nurtured their traditions, ensuring that cultural identity survived beneath the surface of assimilation. As the 20th century progressed under American rule, the Subanen began to articulate their dispossession not only through oral traditions, but also through emerging forms of political awareness. While the term ancestral domain was not yet formalized, the sentiment behind it was deeply felt. Communities recognized that their exile into the mountains, their loss of fertile valleys, and their marginalization in governance all stemmed from one central injustice: the denial of their rights to their ancestral lands. Leaders among the Subanen, often Timuays who had engaged with American officials, began to voice grievances. Some appealed to colonial administrators, seeking recognition of their rights under customary law. Others attempted to reclaim lands by reoccupying abandoned fields, planting crops in defiance of surveys, and asserting that their ancestors had cultivated the soil long before any foreigner claimed it. These early acts of resistance were often met with indifference or hostility by colonial authorities, who prioritized settlers and corporations over indigenous claims. The Subanen struggle for ancestral domain was not yet an organized political movement, but a scattered, localized assertion of identity and survival. Each act of reoccupation, each ritual held in defiance of colonial prohibitions, each story retold around a fire was part of a broader resistance. They were planting seeds of a future consciousness that would, in later decades, grow into demands for recognition and legal rights. Culturally, this struggle was embodied in memory. Subanen elders reminded the young that the rivers, forests, and mountains were not simply resources, but sacred inheritances. To lose them was not only to lose livelihood, but also to lose identity. This perspective became the anchor of resilience, ensuring that even as colonial policies dispossessed them, the Subanen retained a vision of belonging that could not be extinguished. Thus, under American rule, the Subanen endured another wave of displacement and cultural pressure. Yet their story did not end in silence. By clinging to memory, adapting their rituals, and asserting their claims in small but meaningful ways, they kept alive the dream of returning to their ancestral domain. It was a struggle that would continue long after the Americans departed, a struggle rooted not in documents, but in centuries of lived connection to land and river. When the United States took control of the Philippines in 1898, they inherited not only territories, but also centuries of unresolved conflicts between the Moro Sultanates and the colonizers. Determined to bring peace and order, the Americans launched a series of campaigns against Moro strongholds from 1902 onward. These wars, brutal and unrelenting, reshaped the political and social landscape of Mindanao. For the Subanen, who had long lived in the margins of these power struggles, the campaigns brought both opportunities and new dangers. On one hand, American suppression of Moro raiding fleets reduced the frequency of large-scale slave raids that had haunted Subanen communities for centuries. This offered a degree of relief. The sound of vintas on the rivers was no longer as constant a threat as it had been in earlier times. Some Subanen villages cautiously returned to abandoned lowland areas, hoping that American patrols might provide stability. On the other hand, this fragile security came at the cost of new entanglements. The Americans did not differentiate between Moro resistance and indigenous autonomy. Any group outside direct colonial control was viewed with suspicion. Subanen villages, especially those near contested zones, were sometimes treated as potential allies of Moro fighters or obstacles to American campaigns. Military expeditions that targeted Moro strongholds often passed through Subanen lands. Soldiers confiscated food, demanded guides, or forced villagers to labor as porters. In some cases, American officers accused Subanen communities of harboring Moro fugitives, leading to punitive actions against innocent villages. This mirrored the old pattern of Spanish reprisals, in which the Subanen were punished for conflicts not of their making. Oral accounts recall how families fled once more into the forests at the approach of American troops, fearing both Moro raiders and colonial soldiers alike. Thus, while the decline of raiding fleets lessened one form of insecurity, it was replaced by another: the constant risk of being dragged into the American Moro Wars. For the Subanen, survival required the same strategies of vigilance, mobility, and negotiation that had sustained them for centuries. The American victory over the Moro Sultanates opened large tracts of Mindanao to settlement and economic exploitation. The colonial government declared vast areas of land public domain, inviting migrants from Luzon and Visayas to settle in Mindanao as part of a broader program of agricultural expansion. At the same time, American and foreign corporations acquired concessions for logging, mining, and plantations. For the Subanen, who had no written titles to their ancestral lands, this marked another wave of dispossession. Settlers began arriving in growing numbers, clearing forests, and establishing farms in areas the Subanen had long considered theirs. Logging companies felled trees in upland forests, disrupting hunting and gathering grounds. Plantation agriculture, coconut, abaca, and later rubber, encroached on river valleys where Subanen had cultivated rice and root crops for generations. The legal framework of the colonial state offered no protection to indigenous land claims. Instead, the Subanen were treated as squatters on lands they had lived on for centuries. This expansion compounded the Subanen's marginalization. Displaced from fertile lowlands, many were forced to retreat even further into less hospitable mountain areas. Others became laborers for settlers or companies, working under exploitative conditions for meager wages. Families that had once been self-sufficient found themselves dependent on cash economies controlled by outsiders. Poverty deepened, and with it, vulnerability to manipulation by colonial officials, missionaries, and local elites. Yet, despite these challenges, the Subanen retained their identity. They continued to practice the bucklog and other rituals, often framing them as petitions for protection against the loss of land and livelihood. Oral traditions adapted to the new realities, telling stories not only of Moro raids and Spanish soldiers, but also of settlers and corporations who displaced them. Memory thus remained a tool of resilience, keeping alive the sense that the land belonged to them, even when the law said otherwise. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Subanen developed strategies of negotiation to survive between Moro resistance and American expansion. The Timuays, though stripped of formal political authority under the colonial bureaucracy, continued to act as mediator and protector. some Timuays engaged directly with American officials, seeking to secure limited recognition of their communities. They offered cooperation, such as providing guides or agreeing to schooling, in exchange for reduced pressure on their lands. Others cultivated alliances with settlers or missionaries, bargaining for small concessions that might shield their people from displacement. These negotiations were fragile and often one-sided, but they revealed the pragmatism of Subanen leadership. Rather than confront overwhelming colonial power, they sought to carve out spaces of autonomy within it. This was not surrender, but survival, a way to ensure continuity in a rapidly changing world. Communities that engaged with schools sometimes did so selectively, sending a few children to learn English while maintaining oral traditions at home. Those who worked in plantations often used wages to sustain rituals or rebuild hidden villages in the mountains. Cultural persistence was the core of this strategy. The bucklog ritual remained a defiant affirmation of identity, gathering communities to celebrate survival even amid dispossession. Stories of past resistance against Moro raiders, Spanish soldiers, and now American settlers were retold as moral lessons. Children grew up hearing that the land, though taken by others, still belonged to their ancestors and therefore to them. This belief anchored their resilience, giving meaning to endurance in exile. Thus, in the era of American colonialism, the Subanen once again endured by adapting. They were neither fully subdued nor fully free, existing in the margins of an expanding colonial state. Their history of survival between Moro and Spanish domination had prepared them for this new challenge. By negotiating, remembering, and persisting, they ensured that even amid the pressures of land loss and cultural erosion, the Subanen spirit endured. Among the many practices that carried the Subanen through centuries of displacement, none was more central than the bucklog ritual. In the 20th century, as American colonial rule expanded and settlers poured into the Zamboanga Peninsula, the bucklog remained the heartbeat of Subanen identity. This Thanksgiving ritual, performed on a massive bamboo platform that resonated like a drum when danced upon, served as more than just celebration. It was survival expressed through culture. At its core, the bucklog was a communal affirmation of life. It was held to honor the spirits after surviving calamities, to express gratitude for bountiful harvests, or to remember ancestors who had defended the land. The ritual could last for days, drawing entire villages together in song, dance, and prayer. The pounding rhythm of feet upon bamboo echoed through the forest, reminding all who heard it that the Subanen were still there, still alive, despite centuries of oppression. Under American rule, missionaries and officials often dismissed the bucklog as superstition or sought to replace it with Christian festivals. Yet the Subanen adapted. In some communities, the ritual was framed as a cultural festival rather than a religious rite, allowing it to survive colonial scrutiny. In others, families conducted bucklog quietly in remote areas away from the eyes of missionaries. This dual strategy ensured continuity. Outwardly, some Subanen participated in Catholic processions or American-style native shows, but inwardly, they preserved their sacred ritual intact. The bucklog's endurance was not merely ceremonial, it was political. Each performance reaffirmed ties to land and community, reminding participants that their identity could not be erased by laws, raids, or schools. In a world where land titles were stripped away and foreign settlers claimed ancestral valleys, the bucklog symbolized an unbroken connection to the spirits of rivers and forests. Through this ritual, the Subanen declared that though displaced, they remained rooted. If the bucklog was the heart of Subanen resilience, oral traditions were its voice. Long before colonial chronicles or anthropological studies, the Subanen preserved their history through stories told around fires, in fields, and during rituals. These narratives carried the memory of raids, exiles, and acts of defiance. They ensured that even in exile, even when literacy and foreign languages encroached, the Subanen past remained alive. Stories recounted the bravery of Timuays who resisted tribute collectors, the sorrow of families who lost children to slave raids, and the ingenuity of those who escaped captivity. These accounts were not merely entertainment. They were moral instruction, shaping younger generations with lessons of vigilance, unity, and courage. They emphasized that survival was not guaranteed, but required constant resilience. In this way, oral traditions functioned as both historical archive and survival manual. The American Colonial Project sought to replace oral knowledge with written education in English. Subanen children were taught Western history, arithmetic, and Christian doctrine, often at the expense of their own traditions. Yet families resisted silently. Even as children learned to read textbooks, they also absorbed the oral stories of their elders. This dual education created a tension, but also a strength. The Subanen could navigate the colonial world while preserving their ancestral memory. In the 20th century, oral traditions expanded to include encounters with American officials, settlers, and corporations. Stories were told of families forced off their lands, of rituals held in defiance of missionaries, and of new forms of exploitation. These became part of the Subanen narrative of resilience, linking past traumas under Moro and Spanish domination to present struggles under American and settler expansion. In this way, memory created continuity, ensuring that the Subanen understood themselves not as isolated victims, but as a people with a long history of survival against external domination. The 20th century was an era of profound transformation. Roads, schools, markets, and plantations reshaped the Zamboanga Peninsula. Christian settlers from Luzon and Visayas became the majority in many areas, relegating the Subanen to the margins. Yet, even in this environment of cultural erosion, the Subanen identity persisted. Their survival was not passive but active, rooted in adaptation, ritual, and memory. The Timuay remained a figure of resilience, even as his political power was undermined by colonial and later national authorities. While American officials preferred appointed leaders who followed bureaucratic rules, communities still looked to their Timuay for guidance in times of crisis. His role as mediator, spiritual guardian, and protector of tradition continued, ensuring that Subanen governance did not vanish even under external rule. Subanen families also preserved identity through daily practices. Songs sung during planting and harvest carried echoes of ancestral struggles. Crafts such as weaving and beadwork retained symbolic patterns that linked generations. Even dietary habits, root crops grown in hidden fields, communal feasting during rituals, reinforced cultural distinctiveness. These practices might have appeared mundane to outsiders, but for the Subanen, they were acts of cultural defiance. Perhaps most importantly, the Subanen's sense of identity remained tied to land. Even as legal frameworks denied them ownership, they continued to believe that rivers, forests, and fields belonged to their ancestors and therefore to them. This belief was not only spiritual but also practical. It justified their persistence in cultivating land despite eviction threats. It fueled their rituals, and it sustained their oral traditions. In essence, identity was anchored in the conviction that they were inseparable from the land, no matter who claimed it. By mid-century, as American rule gave way to Philippine independence, the Subanen remained marginalized. Yet their rituals endured, their stories continued, and their identity held firm. They were still the Subanen, shaped by centuries of exile, tested by colonizers and settlers, but unbroken in their cultural core. Their persistence in the 20th century was not the story of a people fading away, but of a people enduring, adapting, and carrying their heritage forward into a new era of struggle and resilience. When the Philippines gained independence in 1946, the Subanen, like many other indigenous peoples of Mindanao, hoped for respite after centuries of domination by sultanates, Spaniards, and Americans. The departure of colonial rulers seemed to promise a chance for self-determination, cultural renewal, and security over ancestral lands. Yet for the Subanen, independence was not liberation, but the beginning of a new form of marginalization under a modern nation-state that prioritized settler expansion, economic development, and integration over indigenous rights. The new Philippine government inherited American land policies that classified untitled ancestral domains as public land. Instead of reversing this injustice, the post-colonial state deepened it, continuing to encourage migration from Luzon and Visayas into Mindanao as part of nation-building projects. Settlers were offered land through homesteading programs, while indigenous groups like the Subanen were sidelined. Once again, the legal framework treated them as squatters on their own ancestral territories. At the same time, development projects proliferated. Logging concessions were granted to corporations that stripped forests from the Zamboanga Peninsula. Mining ventures extracted resources from Subanen uplands, often without consultation or consent. Dams and road-building projects displaced communities, flooding farmlands and opening remote areas to settlers. For the Subanen, these projects brought neither prosperity nor progress. They brought dispossession, poverty, and further exile into the margins. The irony was stark. After centuries of foreign domination, it was now the independent Philippine state, ostensibly their own government, that continued to deny them security over their lands. Independence had replaced foreign colonizers with internal policies that privileged outsiders, leaving the Subanen once again as refugees in their ancestral homeland. The promises of freedom and equality rang hollow in the mountains of Zamboanga, where Subanen families struggled to hold on to shrinking plots of land amid waves of encroachment in the decades following independence. Successive Philippine administrations pursued aggressive modernization and integration policies in Mindanao. These policies, while framed as national development, disproportionately harmed indigenous peoples. For the Subanen, the impact was profound. One major policy was the government's land resettlement program. Thousands of families from Luzon and Visayas were relocated to Mindanao, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s, in an effort to decongest the northern islands and boost Mindanao's agricultural productivity. These settlers, often armed with land titles issued by the state, occupied lands that the Subanen had cultivated for generations. The Subanen, lacking legal documents, were displaced yet again. Encounters between settlers and indigenous communities frequently led to tensions, conflicts, and violence. The government also granted logging and mining concessions to politically connected elites and corporations. In the Zamboanga Peninsula, vast forests were stripped bare by commercial logging operations. Rivers that had sustained Subanen communities for centuries were polluted or dried up due to deforestation and mining runoff. The ecological destruction was catastrophic, undermining the very foundation of Subanen survival. For a people whose identity was tied to rivers and forests, the degradation of their environment was not just economic loss, but cultural trauma. Education policies furthered cultural assimilation. Schools expanded into remote areas, promoting Tagalog English, and Christian values while sidelining indigenous languages and traditions. The Timuays system was delegitimized in favor of barangay captains and mayors appointed under national law. Rituals such as the bucklog were dismissed as mere folklore, stripped of their sacred meaning. While some Subanen used gained opportunities through schooling, many others experienced alienation, caught between the world of their ancestors and the expectations of a state that viewed them as backward. This marginalization was compounded by neglect. The Subanen remained among the poorest communities in Mindanao, with limited access to healthcare, infrastructure, and markets. Their political voice was muted, drowned out by the interests of settlers, corporations, and state officials. In effect, the independent Philippines continued the colonial legacy of treating the Subanen as outsiders in their own homeland. Despite these challenges, the Subanen did not disappear into silence. Their history of resilience, forged through centuries of exile and domination, enabled them to endure even under the weight of post-colonial marginalization. Rituals, oral traditions, and the authority of the Timuay persisted, often in hidden or adapted forms. The bucklog continued to be performed, sometimes reframed as a cultural festival for state recognition, but always retaining its deeper spiritual meaning within the community. Oral traditions preserve stories not only of Moro raids and Spanish campaigns, but also of settlers, corporations, and state officials who displaced them in the modern era. By the latter half of the 20th century, seeds of indigenous advocacy began to sprout. Subanen leaders and elders, aware of the injustice of land dispossession, started to articulate claims to ancestral domain. They drew upon their oral traditions, cultural practices, and historical memory to assert that their ties to land were older and deeper than any settler's title. These early voices laid the groundwork for later indigenous movements that would demand legal recognition under frameworks like the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997. At the community level, resilience was expressed through everyday acts of cultural persistence. Families continued to teach Subanen language to their children, even when schools discouraged it. Ritual specialists, the Balian, continued to mediate between the community and the spirits of land and water, ensuring continuity of belief. The Timuay remained a respected figure, even if stripped of legal authority, embodying the community's refusal to fully surrender their traditions. Thus, while Philippine independence deepened Subanen marginalization, it also sowed the seeds of renewed resistance. The Subanen endured by holding onto their identity, preserving their rituals, and preparing to assert their rights in a modern political arena. Their story in the post-colonial era was not only one of dispossession, but also of quiet defiance and emerging advocacy. It was a continuation of the same resilience that had carried them through centuries of raids, exile, and colonial domination. By the late 20th century, the Subanen found themselves at a crossroads. After centuries of displacement under the Moro Sultanates, the Spanish, and the Americans, the Philippine nation-state had brought yet another cycle of dispossession through settler migration, logging, and mining concessions. Yet this period also saw the rise of indigenous advocacy movements, as global discourses on indigenous rights converged with local struggles for survival. The Subanen, though long marginalized, began to find allies and frameworks through which they could assert their claims. The 1970s and 1980s were pivotal. During the Marcos dictatorship, logging and mining intensified across Mindanao. Martial law allowed corporations and cronies to exploit upland resources without consultation or consent from indigenous peoples. For the Subanen, this meant further destruction of forests, rivers, and farms, but also sparked resistance. Subanen leaders, and their supporters began documenting their traditions and asserting that they had ancestral rights predating colonial and national governments. Organizations like the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples and non-governmental groups provided platforms for advocacy, linking Subanen voices to broader indigenous movements. This growing awareness culminated in landmark legislation, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997. For the first time, Philippine law recognized the concept of ancestral domain, acknowledging that indigenous groups had inherent rights to lands occupied and cultivated by their ancestors. For the Subanen, this was a breakthrough. Communities could now apply for certificates of ancestral domain titles, CADs, a legal recognition of their ancestral claims. Yet the process was fraught with challenges, bureaucratic delays, opposition from corporations and settlers, and internal divisions. Still, IPRA represented hope. It validated what the Subanen had always known, that their connection to land was sacred, historical, and enduring. It provided a language and framework through which they could resist further displacement, linking their centuries-old struggle to contemporary legal and political battles. For the Subanen, the rise of indigenous movements marked the beginning of a new chapter, not one of exile alone, but of assertion and advocacy. The recognition of ancestral domain under IPRA did not instantly resolve the Subanen struggles. In practice, claiming land through CADs required navigating a maze of surveys, documentation, and legal processes. For communities whose traditions were rooted in oral history rather than written records, this posed immense difficulties. Elders testified about ancestral boundaries based on rivers, mountains, and sacred groves, but surveyors often demanded maps and documents that the Subanen did not have. Corporations and local elites resisted ancestral domain claims, seeing them as threats to economic interests. Logging firms argued that forests were state property, while mining companies secured permits from the government that overlapped with Subanen lands. Even when CADs were issued, enforcement was weak. Subanen leaders reported harassment, threats, and even violence from armed groups protecting corporate concessions. In some cases, the state itself contradicted its laws by granting mining rights within recognized ancestral domains, undermining the very spirit of IPRA. Despite these obstacles, Subanen communities persisted. They organized councils of elders, revitalized the authority of the Timuays, and sought alliances with NGOs, church groups, and international advocacy networks. Rituals like the bucklog became rallying points not only for cultural affirmation, but also for political assertion. When performed in public, the bucklog declared to the world that the Subanen were not relics of the past, but living communities defending their rights. The struggle for ancestral domain was not only about land, but also about dignity. For centuries, the Subanen had been labeled as backward, marginalized, and powerless. By asserting ancestral rights, they challenged these stereotypes, reclaiming agency in their own history. Even when victories were partial or delayed, the process itself strengthened community solidarity and revived a sense of collective purpose. Today, the Subanen story is one of resilience carried across centuries of adversity. From the time of Moro raids and Spanish campaigns to American land dispossession and post-colonial marginalization, they endured exile, displacement, and cultural suppression. Yet through it all, they preserved their rituals, their oral traditions, and their identity as riverine people transformed by exile, but unbroken in spirit. The legacy of resilience is evident in how the Subanen navigate modern challenges. They continue to perform the bucklog, now recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, symbolizing both cultural survival and global recognition. Their oral traditions still recount the bravery of Timuays who resisted raiders and colonizers, ensuring that new generations inherit not only trauma, but also pride. Their leaders, though still marginalized in national politics, have begun to assert themselves in regional forums, advocating for indigenous rights and environmental protection. The Subanen's experience also offers broader lessons. Their survival shows that resilience is not only about physical endurance, but also about cultural persistence. It is about transforming trauma into ritual, memory into strength, and exile into identity. Even when stripped of fertile lands, even when displaced into mountains, even when facing the overwhelming forces of sultanates, empires, and states, the Subanen held onto their sense of who they were. Their story continues today as they confront modern threats, mining, logging, and climate change, with the same determination that carried them through centuries of struggle. They are no longer only victims of history, but active participants in shaping their future. In their resilience lies a powerful reminder that survival is not merely the absence of defeat, but the ongoing protection of culture, memory, and identity against the tides of domination. The Subanen's journey, from riverine dwellers to mountain exiles to modern advocates, is a testament to human endurance. It affirms that even the most marginalized communities can persist, adapt, and assert themselves across centuries of displacement. Their legacy is not just a regional story, but part of the broader human struggle for dignity, land, and identity in the face of relentless external pressures.